My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by the one and only, the man with the mustache and accompanying beard and accessory facial hair, Max Aita. How's it going, Max?
That was possibly the greatest intro I've ever had to a podcast. Yes, I'm a man with a mustache and accompanying facial hair. The full boat. I'm good. I'm doing great. I've got a cold brew, which I think is probably a little bit too much caffeine for me. I'm delicate, but it's getting me riled up. I'm excited for this podcast. It's a great topic. Yeah. So, what was the topic? People we hate in USA weightlifting? No, I'm just kidding.
And you mentioning the coffee you're drinking, I have pretty much finished my pour over, and
Nice.
I've realized, like, when I moved in, when I lived with you for those few months and really got exposed to good coffee, and then kind of like, you know, we would just go work at coffee shops. You drink a lot of different types of coffee, different preparations, different beans, different types of roasts. I feel like I'm actually a man now who can discern good coffee from bad coffee. I feel like it took a while, but I'm kind of there.
You know, it's funny. I'm not like a coffee aficionado. I'm not the kind of person who, like, you know, gets all excited about like some different type of coffee or whatever. I have a type of coffee I enjoy. I enjoy a specific smooth, dark roast type of coffee, espresso only. So I'm like a particular kind of person with that. I don't have a big, like, you know, I don't have like a coffee journal that I keep when I record, like, you know, 2 p.m., you know, fresh roasted blonde beans in the siphon. You know, my mood was slightly aroused, but tired from the day's struggles. Coffee, 9 out of 10. Not me, but I do love my type of coffee. And yeah, so
you're also the
stick on coffee.
Well, you're also the only person I know who gets decaf coffee. And people talk about it all the time. I think there's this like running joke, running unspoken joke of, oh, I drink way too much caffeine. You know, laugh out loud. But you're actually the only person I know who drinks decaf coffee.
Yeah, you know what? I used to drink tons of coffee. Like, I would drink probably like 4 like 20-ounce drip coffees a day back when I was like coaching and lifting at different gyms, and it was just way too much. And at some point, like when we got the espresso maker, we have the espresso machine we have now, like I was just making so many coffees. It was back to that day where I was having like 7 or 8 espressos a day, and I was like, this is gonna fuck me up. Like, it's too much caffeine. So I just went to decaf so I could keep drinking 5 or 6 shots a day. And I'll have like a regular coffee in the afternoon to pick me up. But yeah, it's, you know, I don't like being that wired like I used to be.
Yeah, and I almost wonder, and I think this actually is a great lead into the question that we have, or the topic of the podcast. But from your perspective, that time you spent abusing your body with caffeine and coffee, do you feel like that's almost not a rite of passage, but a typical journey for a coach who gets into weightlifting? As like, I've been thinking about this as I get back into the swing of things, you know, after nationals, after, you know, spending some time with my friends and family. Like, there's this kind of come down, and you're like, okay, back to, you know, routine and drudgery and normal life. And just kind of contemplating that. And I was thinking, like, is it really this like rite of passage where you just have to grind your ass off for years? And not because it's like, oh, you got to toughen up, son, but more so because to develop a name, to develop a brand, to develop an expertise, to actually like acquire the skills and abilities that it takes to coach and function at the highest level, that's almost what it requires. Do you feel like that's true, or do you feel like that's like typical, that people
Hmm.
just generally kind of have to go through that like slog of a few years busting their asses?
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
I think that's a great question. And I would say that ultimately the answer to that question is that the nature of like the slogging through things and sort of trial and error and having to figure things out is a byproduct of there being a very small community in a very niche sport. Less than 1 million people are doing this in the United States. And so it creates a thing where like there's just not a lot of knowledge. There's actually, there's quite a few books written about weightlifting, but there isn't like a really vast like base of knowledge about how to be a weightlifting coach or do this. And so I think a lot of people are kind of sort of, hacking their way through the proverbial jungle of like information and practice and experience. And also like most people are finding their own voice as coaches as they go. So like you might start out with an impression of what weightlifting and coaching is going to be like, and then it changes as years go on and you meet new athletes and you find that like, your dreams were to work with like top male lifters and take a super heavyweight to the Olympics, but like, reality hands you whatever, a bunch of 64 kilo gymnasts that are, really good. So it's like there's a lot of that, like you said, like this drudgery and sort of like taking long time to get from being brand new to being pretty experienced, pretty like developed as a coach is probably just a byproduct of all those factors, right? Like it's just not, there's no school you can go to and graduate with a degree in weightlifting, or coaching weightlifting or even coaching that would be, elevating you to the level of, an experienced coach.
No, and I think that's entirely right. I think, most people would say that like getting an undergraduate degree probably isn't the hardest thing, and you could get a really good job with an undergrad degree. I mean, especially if it's in
Mm-hmm.
some sort of engineering or computer science, or like data science, as we've seen, as you can kind of see in the Bay Area. Like,
Oh yeah.
you don't need a PhD to make a lot of money and to get a really high paying job or high profile job. I think as you mentioned, as everything becomes more and more niche, as things become more disorganized, as things become more like uh, more kind of like handed down, it's harder and harder. So
Yeah.
you have to work to kind of figure things out. There's no like cemented path you can follow. There's a lot of competition, and the people who are at the top kind of stay at the top. So there's not a lot underneath it. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, you can be like successful by association, but that only sustains you on social
Yeah.
media. So
Yeah.
I think that's true in that like the less organized, uh, the less like structured, and uh, the less opportunity, the harder it is. And I think you see that in every profession at the highest levels, but you see that in weightlifting just kind of across the board because it is
For
so much
sure.
smaller.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, if people, and this is the topic of the podcast, if people had access to all of the same information, which we do, right? But if people were able to access that information and understand it, integrate it, and use it, so all of the same coaching knowledge or information, would we end up getting the same product? Would we end up getting the same program? Would we end up getting
Mhm.
the exact same coaching from person to person to person? And I don't mean you would look at a 12-week program for a 64 kilo lifter and a 109 plus and say, oh, those are the exact same programs. What I'm saying is you would get the exact same approach or methodology for each, in the sense of, from start to finish, the process would look the exact same of figuring it out. Do you think that's
Yeah.
true?
So it's an interesting question, right? The fundamental thing here is like, is there a perfect program for an individual? Meaning, is there a program, or is the coaching, programming, the apparatus, can it be optimized to the point where it is flawless for an individual? And theoretically, if every single person had all the information in the world at their fingertips, would that program just be the same? So if you coached a brand new guy and I coached him, like, theoretically, we would have written the same exact programming and done everything exactly the same, right? And it's a really interesting question, because it comes down to this idea that, like, you know, what is the special difference between one coach or another, or one team or another, or one thing, right? Um, Obviously, like, different populations are going to have different programs, but, like, theoretically, would Liu Xiaojun have done as well if he was on the Russian national team? Would he have done exactly the same numbers if he was on, the Turkish team? And it's interesting, right? Those teams obviously have different programs they deliver to people that are, whatever, but, like, are those programs actually perfectly well suited for the people they're getting? If that was the case, then any lifter could go to any country and succeed, right? Um, so I don't know. I don't know if there's a perfect program. I think the differentiating factor at every level is going to be the execution of that knowledge. So it's, we all have all the answers. We know all the right answers. Who can execute on it better? Who can get the most out of the program, get the most out of the training? Who can, get to the most granular level of everything and implement things as flawlessly as possible? I mean, that theoretically is the way a lot of sports is, right? It just becomes completely refined, more and more refined, to the point that, like, if you look back in the day with weightlifting, I mean, we did a podcast, remember, years, probably last year, about, the Olympics and weightlifting, and how different and strange it was. Like, training was weird too. People will say things about, like, you know, uh, uh, whatever, Abajev, but Abajev started training people in a time, he started training like every day, twice a day, in a time when people trained like 3 times a week, right? And so, that's like a dramatically, big change between those things. The evolution of things has made it more and more refined right now, where it's like, oh, well, that's not weird to train every day, multiple times a day. Everybody's program looks really, really, really similar, and that's a byproduct of refinement, right? So I guess what I'm getting to is, theoretically, I think the answer is yes. The written plan and what people have decided is the path, and those things, the strategy, would look very, very similar. Maybe not identical, but very similar between top coaches for the same athlete. But the execution would be the thing that differentiates, one athlete, or, one coach from another.
So then, do you think it ultimately becomes accessibility to information that can develop the coaching process? Because you were listing off countries, and I was starting to think, like, why are there so many different approaches or so many different methods to developing weightlifters? Because the way it feels is that we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to develop the snatch and clean and jerk to their max abilities. Um, why do things vary so much or look so different? And I think it has to be either an access thing or, like
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned, an execution thing. And I think kind of where I get tripped up, I'm kind of in like the developing the execution component, but I think a lot of people are still just at the access phase of it, where it's like, I need exposure to the right information. And to be fair to us, like, the podcast is a great way to do that for people, to say like, hey, here are these concepts or ideas that are relatively well understood and that we operate on and you may not have heard of or you may not have contextualized, and here's how you can think about it when you're writing a program.
Mm-hmm.
Then it becomes executing on the same information. And then once you're able to execute on the information, it's like executing in different situations with the same information. So it's
Yeah.
taking someone who is a 55 kilo female and someone who's 109 and someone who's a youth, junior, and senior, and it's being able to develop a comprehensive roster of athletes, not just kind of a one-off where the stars seem to align. So from your perspective, where do you think most people get caught up? Do you feel like it's an access issue, or is it largely just, as you mentioned, execution?
I think it's both. I think it's an access because one of the problems with refinement is refinement kills innovation, right? So as things become more refined and as the echo chamber gets more condensed, becomes smaller and smaller, you have less variation and less innovation in that system. And so largely the weightlifting space has a much more refined and tight echo chamber than say, like, the CrossFit space did 5 years ago or whatever. So I think access to information becomes more limited because more information appears to be outside of that sphere of usefulness because of the echo chamber. So you end up in a place where it's like, do people think outside the box and try new things and do things differently and design stuff differently, or do they look at it and they're saying like, oh, like, we don't do any weird movements or try new things or do strange shit because that's like, that's not going to work. We already know that won't work. So I think that, yeah, like, access gets limited because of that, but I think also it is a matter of execution. I mean, they're kind of tied together, right? You New information is not valuable unless you do something with it. And so if people aren't first looking for new information or trying new things or getting access to the information they need, and then on top of that, executing that, and implementing that as quickly as they can, there's not a lot of innovation that takes place. So you get to this point, of like, basically people get limited in their ability to grow because they're kind of trapped in this tiny bubble. I think also on top of that, a lot of it is challenging for people because they're trying to facilitate like 5 or 6 things at once, right? You're trying to run a team, trying to coach people, you're trying to make money, you're trying to survive. Like, so it becomes a lot of defaulting to what are the easiest ways to get those things done,
Well, and honestly, I think we're on the same wavelength, because I was going to bring that up. I think as the required skill set increases, it becomes more and more difficult to execute on every single aspect of it. So if you think of a weightlifter and you think about what's necessary to maximize performance, you have nutritional inputs, you have programming inputs, you have technical inputs, you have um, lifestyle inputs. You have a lot of different buckets that you have to either, one, try to master and understand, or you have to develop a team who can kind of tackle each different aspect. And
Yeah.
the coaches who try to do it all, I think that inherently is limiting. And to be fair to coaches who are like, that's what I try to do, I also try to do that. I try to
Yeah.
understand it all as much as humanly possible, and I'd love to take on the responsibility of all of it as well. Um, but in doing that, you really limit your development in one space. And I think for weightlifting coaches, what they should be, and maybe this is like a mission statement for like weightlifting coaches, writ large, but you should master programming and the programming component and the technical development of an athlete. You should know
Yeah.
every single thing about programming and technique and then everything else is like secondary and tertiary. And while it's relevant, I think the inputs are so much like the effects are so much smaller that they almost just like you should be smart enough at some point to say like, hey, let's get some sort of registered dietitian,
Hmm.
let's get a sports psychologist, like let's get a team to support the other aspects, because there's way too much to know about programming and the development of technique and the management of the training process to try and just occupy yourself with that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you mentioned, right? It's much easier to block yourself off and to say, well, we just don't do that, because when you just don't do that, you don't have to consider all of the situations in which it's relevant. And having this like Rolodex of exercises and set and rep combinations and training effects and frequencies and durations and physiological changes that stem from all of that stuff, like that's a lot to consider. And not only is it a lot to consider, but it's a lot to consider every single time you put your fingers to a keyboard to write a
Hmm.
program.
Yeah. Well, that's what copy and paste is for. No, actually, to sort of talk to that too, it's like that's actually one of the major reasons why, you know, like I've gone down the road of doing what I've done with the AI project, right? It's a question of like, what is a better way? And like as a coach, every coach does this. You implement trial and error into your coaching. You guess. Coaches guess way more than they probably admit. They come up like how many coaches could definitively say like this exercise we're going to give you is going to fix this problem you have, right? Like, oh, you jump forward, do no hook no feet. And and like we know from and like our experience that will improve and correct some of that issue, but like there's no real hard research that's shown a lot of this stuff, right? Coaches will oftentimes do things where they are playing this game of trial and error, right? Give somebody a certain number of, a certain set rep scheme in the squat, or choose a different exercise, or do whatever. And there's a randomness to it, and sort of a just kind of like throwing a lot of things at the wall and seeing what sticks, looking for indicators that prescription they gave was good. There's too many of these variables for a person to track, right? You're not going to be able to sit there and say, I don't know of coaches that are doing this where they sit there and they write it out. We did evaluated, we did, clean front squat jerk. And then we measured with force plates what was happening. And we, measured blood lactate levels and did a muscle biopsy. Like, we just don't have this kind of testing that exists. But from the perspective of like, are there just a lot of variables that we essentially need to throw into a model and try to gain some kind of insight as to, hey, you know, when you do X, Y, and Z in training, it's more effective, or the people that did this made more progress than people who did something different. And that gives us, an answer that's less wrong than our initial thoughts. And I think with AI, that's like the intent is to say, let's create a process and a system that gives us both inputs and outputs. We define what we're trying to achieve with the training means and methods, and then we evaluate that and we give it to a broad population of people and we see what happens. And something that we've actually talked about, like implementing that idea of not randomness, but trial and error into a machine learning kind of model is necessary, because we don't want to just train ourselves to be really good at knowing what we put down on paper, right? If you wrote a program and then you tried to train a model on your program, like if you were just going to write your system of training out and then use that system and train a model to replicate that system, you've given it no possibility that your system could be wrong. So it just assumes like everything's going to get spit out as like, this is what you're going to get back every time. And that's what happens to coaches is they write a certain program, they have success with it, and then they just iterate on that and just keep delivering that same thing to people, right? When it doesn't work, there might just be a throw the hands in the air moment and say, oh, okay, whatever. Like, you just chickened out on your attempt or whatever it is. I see it as like, we should be trying to find out if the answer to your question in this podcast is true. Is there an optimal program for a particular kind of person, right? 27-year-old, 5'5", 73-kilo lifter. Like what is the best program for him the same as it is for everybody else in that same demographic? And we know that people respond differently because of their genetics. There's so many possible combinations of genetics, but that question still becomes like, how close can we get to knowing that there's like an optimal sort of, target program for somebody?
Yeah, and I guess the AI is a great case study. The weightlifting AI is a great case study for this question, because you have to develop it from the top down. You have to develop it from like broad, overarching concepts to very, very small decision making aspects of the programming process. And that's kind of ultimately, I think, what the question gets at. It's like, if all of the most theoretical information is understood from a sport physiology standpoint, from a training theory standpoint, if you take all of that broad information and then you filter it and filter it and filter it and filter it to the smallest unit, which is the athlete, I would imagine you would almost need to get the same program, because it's considering all available information, which would optimize every single aspect of frequency, intensity,
Right.
Duration, exercise selection, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I feel like AI is what most effectively is going to be able to do that. And you're not going to get a method riddled program that's like, we do conjugate for our squats and we do
Mm-hmm.
Texas method for our snatches, and it just like that. That stuff just, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that's a way that's
Right.
generally programmed. So people who are listening, they go back to the training talks episode where we talk about writing a squat program or not writing a squat program for a weightlifter. You kind of understand that, like, we're not piecing together methods into a weightlifter's program. We're taking a weightlifter and we're trying to develop something that's going to maximize each component of performance across time, which will look different, right? And I guess that's kind of like understanding everything as well as possible and then individualizing it. One thing
Yeah.
that I sometimes have a hard time remembering is exactly why we do what we do as coaches, and I think most people listening will also relate to this. I talked to Kyle Pierce a few times, and
Mm-hmm.
I remember I looked at his program and I thought, like, why does he do the lifts why does he program the lifts the way he programs them? And there's an article, it's a research paper. It's not research, it's just him like writing commentary on the way he develops youth athletes. But he mentions meeting a Hungarian weightlifter and talking to him about uh, the snatch and clean and jerk. And the weightlifter said, a lot of the programming should occur. I might be misremembering, but a lot of the programming should happen at the power position, because that's going to most effectively teach people to use their legs. So if
Mm.
you look at programs he writes, a lot of the volume, I think he said like 50% of the volume for youth athletes and maybe for like other programs would be at the power position. They're doing a lot of power position snatches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something he picked up from one conversation with one
Yeah.
guy, and that is stuck with him and persisted through the way he programs. And I think about that, like, what do I do? What quirks do I have that actually just stem from one conversation or one idea, but you can see riddled in every single program that has
Yeah.
no basis or no foundation? And I'm not saying it's wrong, because I
Yeah.
think I think where you can easily get lost is this idea of like, every athlete needs something hyper specific. It's like, yeah, if you actually want to maximize the result, they do, but you can kind of get improvements through a bandwidth of approaches. And I
Yeah.
think that's where the problem kind of comes up, is like, well, a lot of stuff works for each person, and it's like, true, but it works because there's just this like generalizability of training. There's this like broad sensitivity to it, versus this necessity of having everything dialed in. Now if you have someone who's trying to go from what, like, running a 4.340 to running a 4.2540, or something that's like really discrete, really high level, the training is going to have to be a lot more dialed in.
Yeah.
Most of us don't work with weightlifters who need that. We're not working with people, say maybe like a Travis Cooper, who's been weightlifting for
Mm-hmm.
20 years and has really reached, a tremendously high level and has tried a lot of stuff, done a lot of stuff, and experimented a lot. And he needs something maybe that's like as correct as anyone else to make progress, if he can.
Yeah.
Most people aren't like
Yeah.
that. So you get this, like, if you're close enough, kind of effect. Whereas like some things will work, some work better, some don't. So you can have those aspects of your program that are relics of conversations, books you've read, experiences you've had. And I don't know how you would actually screen for that or remove them. I don't know if it's necessary, but yeah, I think the coaching process is a lot less refined, kind of as you
Yeah.
mentioned, and as that point attempted to mention, than a lot of people give it credit for.
Yeah. I think that's a great, uh, like that's the reality is like what you want to do as a coach is remove your own personal biases that are not serving you well, right? It's the more biases you have in your thought process towards doing things, the more restricted you are to adapting a training program or your coaching style to somebody, right? Because you're going to get to a place where it's like you're essentially incorporating things into a program because of like you said, like a single conversation you had or the way you saw someone do something. One of the best examples of that is Kyle Pierce, like you said, but also, um, it's like if somebody started, Liu Jiajun starts doing squat jerks, or the Chinese start doing panda pulls, like how many people start doing that too? And it's just like, oh, well, he's successful, I'm gonna throw that in there. And so, it becomes this thing of like, okay, you're gonna get this result because it's just these biases you have that are stuck in there. You want to remove that as much as possible so you can get to the most right answers, the least wrong answers about training somebody.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Which is not easy, right? And we've
No,
had
it's very hard.
we've had so many conversations about, and what immediately came to mind is the frequency and volume of the snatch and clean pull in a program.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think how out of most things, that's probably the least well understood and the well executed on, and on my
Hmm.
end as well. Like I look at pulls and I think about like the frequency of which I would have pulls, the intensities at which I would have them programmed in, and how that would change. And it almost just feels like, when you read, say you read one of the books you've written and it says,
Hmm.
you should pull 2 to 4 times per week. And you're like, oh yeah, I should probably do that. So you put pulls in 3 days per week. You do 2 snatch and 1 clean. And then you say, okay, how's that going to fit to the variations we're using? How's that going to fit to the technical problems the lifter has? How's that going to affect the speed qualities of the lifter? And like you individualize it, but the frequency was kind of taken for granted at the outset. So the
Right.
other the other answers to those questions are answers to like uh, unnecessary questions, because you the assumption can be wrong, and the assumption is we should pull 2 to 4 days a week, and I'm
Yeah.
just going to split the difference and go 3. And so
Yep.
you already start from this weird premise, and then try to make decisions off of it. So I almost wonder like how much of the training process is like that, where these like baseline ideas, these like bedrock concepts of frequency and intensity are taken for granted, and then all of the answers that we provide that feel like they're super certain and feel like they're super correct are operating on like a false premise of I need to do this 3 days per week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the best example of that is like squatting every day. It's just like what is the what why, right? Like the amount of squatting you do should be dictated by the results you're trying to achieve in the squat
Right.
and the results you get. Because theoretically, it's like, okay, are you creating like the idea of a squatting, right? Squatting every day could be implementation of something other than trying to drive strength in the squat, right? It could be that, oh, we squat every day because these tertiary benefits we get from doing that. It like whatever, myriad of different things you could achieve from squatting every day, more mobility or, more comfort in the squat or more skill or more, whatever, these things that are not just a direct result of make your squat go up. But it's funny because, like you said, it's just an arbitrary choice. Oh, let's just squat every day, or we should pull 3 times a week because it's between 2 and 4, and like those are just like these bizarre, arbitrary choices that ultimately everything is built on this, like a foundation of lies. Really, you're trapped in this place where now you've just started because that seemed like the good place to start, and then you start to fit your program to that assumption. Well, you got to squat every day, so then I got to build a weightlifting program out of how do I squat every day, and then you get a program that eventually gets to this point where it's like all of what exists in the program is there as it's there, and it's in the position and place and dose that it's there as a way to satisfy your initial assumption about something else, which was, in this example, that you have to squat every day, right? And so how much of a program is built from the idea of something initially that's wrong, and then just you pile more things on top of that to satisfy that?
Well, and that's really tough because the more you know, and this is I think pretty reliable. Like the more you know, the stronger a case you can make for your position, even if
Right.
it's wrong, right? Because you can connect a lot of disparate or even relevant information and say like, "Hey, I need to squat every day because," and then you layer on theory because
Yeah.
theoretically I need to improve my mobility, and a lot of this is like best guess. It's our best
Yeah.
guess at what we're going to be able to do and what we need to do and how the body works or how our bodies work when stress is applied. And you would say, well, I need more mobility, I need improved practice or better practice or more practice, I need more familiarity, and then you start just like you literally just as your mind generates explanations for something, you come up with a case for it, and then as you mentioned, you would then create a program that's like wrapped around
Yep.
squatting every day instead of a program that's wrapped around squatting frequently enough and intensely enough to drive weightlifting results, which as we mentioned on the last episode of the podcast, it was the athlete case studies podcast, that
Mhm.
you honestly should be able to clean and jerk a high percentage of your front squat. So when people are like, oh man, that's getting really close, it's like, that's great. That means your
Yeah.
training's going really well and it's effective weightlifting training. It's not just effective strength training.
So that's an interesting question, right? If we take that premise of, your program should be designed around, like theoretically, your program should be designed, or any training block should be designed around a primary objective, right? You have to define the objective, because if you can't define the objective, who knows what you're actually accomplishing, right? And then from that point, you have to define what are the key parameters that we can definitively say, you know, develop that prime objective. And so, like, an example would be like, that's why we design blocks of training, right? We design a hypertrophy block or a strength block or whatever it is. We express a specific goal, and then from there, we work towards that with best practices, the things we know, through research, through evidence, through practical experience, are going to achieve that goal, and then we measure and test ourselves against it. And then we can accurately look at, okay, we did a quote unquote hypertrophy block for for your legs or lower body. We did it. We ended up with 2 kilos of muscle, and we had this big increase in blah blah blah, right? You could then say, okay, let's try that same thing later and implement a different strategy to try to achieve that goal, right? Oh, well, last time we did sets of 10, this time we'll do sets of 8. And was it more effective, less effective, as effective? So like that's the reality of what we should be doing in the training process is explicitly, you know, as explicitly as possible, defining our goals, our objectives with each training block, and then measuring ourselves against that.
Well, and that's why things can get fuzzy, right? Is because we're operating off of probabilities and correlations.
Yeah.
And I actually had a conversation yesterday. It was actually a really fun one, and we talked about sport performance, specifically with volleyball. And they're like, well, someone might say, hey, I want something that's like sport specific in the weight room. And you would say, well, the only thing that's sport specific is playing volleyball. Like that, the sport itself is going to make you a better volleyball player. Everything else is general. And I know we've talked about this where it's like, hey, on the football field, you're becoming a better football player. In the weight room, you're developing your potential to become a better football player. And you're operating again off of best guesses and correlations. And I think we lose sight of how that's the same for weightlifting. If you're not snatching or clean and jerking, you're not actually directly improving. You're not as tightly improving performance. You're just getting a proxy for what could be performance improvement. And a squat happens to be something that's more highly correlated than a leg press, but they're both trying to accomplish the same end. So if you're looking at building muscle, the bandwidth for like doing that effectively can change. If you're doing that for, say strength, the bandwidth tightens. If you're doing that for, speed or specifically like pulling speed, the bandwidth tightens. And if you're saying, well, I want to become better at snatching and I want to become a better snatcher, and you're not thinking in terms of, well, we need to get stronger, faster, et cetera, that bandwidth narrows even more. So again, it's I guess a lot of this really hinges on the questions you ask initially and then the answers you provide, because that's going to change the way you write every single piece of the program after the fact. So if you say like we have to squat, or we have to squat every day, or we have to get bigger, that creates a lot of different questions that you can really have like great answers for, but they're kind of irrelevant.
Here's a good question, right? We know we can look at statistical, analysis of training logs that we've seen. The Soviet research is really good at this. And you could look at something and say, okay, like the correlation between your results in the total and the number of 90% lifts you did, in training the month before that are highly correlated, right? We have less definitive correlation as the intensity of the bar drops, right? So it's this interesting question of like, well, if all you did was 90% lifts, shouldn't that number go up? And there's a definite limit, right? If you just did 90% lifts, no, the number won't go up, right? We know that like if that's all you're trained at, you're not going to get better. And so it's a question of like, okay, well, what is it then? Like we can't look at like all the 70 and 80, 85% intensity volume you do, which is the bulk of what we do in training anyways. We can't look at that and say, oh, definitively doing this XYZ workout, 5 triples at 80%, doing that workout made me X amount stronger, right? Or even like squatting, like doing, I did that 5x5 at 100 kilos, like that made me, 1.2% stronger. Because one, we just don't have the we don't have the ability to measure that, right? So this interesting question of like something like, oh, well, the number of 90% lifts you do in training is correlated highly with the results. Is that a byproduct of, say, the fact that you've improved your familiarity and skill with 90% plus weights, which translates to your ability to realize your actual potential, but that potential is developed somewhat lighter at those, the bulk of your 70 to 90% lifts, everything under 90%. So you get what I'm saying? Like, it's this funny question of like, we can see correlation, we don't necessarily see causation, right? And we can design things around program, around these variables that we know have a direct correlation, but it's really more a matter of like, you have to zoom out a little more even to the big picture of like, well, what do the most successful programs look like? We probably have to mimic that in its entirety, and play in that sandbox, adjusting variables to make things work.
No, that makes complete sense, and it's why coaching is it's why coaching can be like a lifetime or a lifelong kind of interest, is because nothing is so well known that it's like a matter of fact, right? And as you mentioned, like knowing that the highest, some of the highest correlation training is the highest intensity training. It's like, well, you can't do that for different reasons, and you're not going to effectively change different qualities to then drive future performance for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So then you start working down this list of, well, if not this, then what? And if not that, then what? And
Mm-hmm.
if we need these other things, how do we develop them? So you have to look at this like comprehensive picture of, what does a good athlete look like? What does the best athlete look like? There's someone who, they've very obviously filled out their weight class. They have as much contractile muscle as possible in the areas necessary for elevating the barbell. They have certain speed qualities. They have certain technical qualities. They have certain psychological characteristics. There's like an archetype, and there are many
Yeah.
different archetypes. And you're saying, okay, we have to work backwards from this concept of what's the weightlifting archetype that we want to build towards, and then we have to answer the questions of like, how do we get there, and are we getting there? And
Yeah.
that's I think why we both have become interested at different for different reasons with testing, in the
Yeah.
sense of like testing, performance testing, to say like, are we on track within a program? And for me, it's like more granular testing of like, I want to look at someone's muscle and know how it's changing size. I
Yeah.
want to look at like different like force production characteristics and say like, how is that changing across time? Like I want rock solid data. And a lot of that, I guess, for me is just like this like struggle with uncertainty during the training process of like, are we doing what we say we're doing? And if I can't confidently say yes, it feels wasted or it feels useless. And even if there's an effect, like a positive effect, I want to know why there's improvement in spite of what we're doing or why we're trying to do it, versus like, as we may have mentioned or talked about before, if you're right, sometimes it's easy to just kick your feet up, put your hands behind your head, and say, "Oh, we figured it out. Like, let's just repeat that," instead of, why were we right, and can we know
Mm-hmm.
why we were right? And I guess that for me has made this like something that's continued to pique my interest, is that idea of, why are we right, instead of, oh, we're right, let's just do it again.
Yeah. I think that's a super interesting place for us to be, like, because I find there to be interesting, like a very interesting sort of, I guess, like conundrum here, in that like, it's okay, how do we best develop a system for understanding what training is doing and predicting results? Because if we can develop that system, how effective can our training be? Like, if we can reliably say that the things we're doing are going to increase performance, it keeps us on track to do the right things. Or it gives us insight as to why the program failed, or why someone didn't make PRs, didn't make progress, you know? Um, and that's like a really challenging thing, because it's like, well, the most accurate test we have is like to max out a lift, right? But that then becomes a question of like, well, are we just going to then sort of, you know, continue to incorporate more and more testing into the process, so that we end up with like this system that's like very heavily reliant on lots of maxing out things and lots of testing, and potentially interferes with like other stuff we could be doing? Or are we going to have to find some more clever way of doing this, but maybe less accurate, right? And so it's like this funny place to be in, of like, well, how do we make our training more effective by understanding what's actually happening in our training, and how do we make our testing as least invasive as possible, so that we end up in a place where we are, you know, doing the best we possibly can.
Well, and I guess you have to end up being someone like, say, a Shaco, and I remember you mentioned this, like all of the training you did, you never maxed out, and you improved tremendously. And to have
Mm-hmm.
that confidence in your understanding of training and your ability to execute on it, to say like, hey, we don't need to do like, I think for me, I don't want to say it's an insecurity, but I think it's like a confidence thing to say, hey, let's have checkpoints in the program. And when you push it and you go for a max, it's not really skill training. I don't when I say, hey, go for a PR behind the neck jerk or go for a max behind the neck jerk, and you put 10 or 15 kilos on it. It's not like, oh, that's the best training you're going to get.
Right.
It's not even a drop in the bucket. It's much smaller than that. It's more so like, oh, here's confidence, we're doing the right thing. You've always been able to do this, right?
Right.
It's not the sun didn't come up and then grant you the ability on a single day to put 10 plus kilos on your PR and then take it away from you. So you've been able to do this. You just expressed it for the first time. So the
Yeah.
training has been effective. I almost wonder too, like if you have two programs, you have one with testing at different periods throughout, and you have one that doesn't. They're basically the same program, as long as you say, like, for that heavy single, maybe we'll add in a little bit more training volume or load to equate them. If there would be a difference at the end of like confidence in both the coach and the athlete, and then the ability to perform, given that, like, yeah, again, this whole concept of testing is just that. It's not developmental in any respect. It's more so just so the coach and the athlete both know where the person's at.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people do incorporate some kind of testing, right? They have a lot more frequent, heavy sessions, max out sessions in their program to allow them to, evaluate. Um, Again, it's like one of those things where it's like, how much of that is just developing the ability to express your best result, and that finite skill component is just unlocked a little bit more. It's also, Chris Tabor, when I talked to him the other day, we were talking about the idea of like, what is the smallest increase that could be considered significant, right? And keeping that kind of concept in mind when testing. Doing a training cycle and adding 2 kilos to your total isn't necessarily progress. It's just, you're able to take different numbers and make them, right? But maybe adding 5 kilos is now significant. And so there's this moment of like, okay, we do testing and we achieve a 5 kilogram PR in a lift. That's now significant enough for us to consider that successful, right? Versus just, well, I maxed out and I took 5 attempts at a hang snatch PR of 1 kilo and I made it. Did you really get better?
Well, and there are probably more days where I'm training and you use a program or a strategy where you have a top set every week, and you'll increase, and I've had this happen where I had someone, we pushed her jerk for the first time. She's a great jerker, and she went from like, I don't know, 70 something or 80 something to like 91, and it was a huge PR. And then we went the next week, she went 91 to 100. Yeah, obviously didn't get better, just expressed her jerk a lot
Mm-hmm.
more effectively and efficiently. And then the next week, I think we had one more jerk max out, and she did 101, but it was like shaky and not as great. And it's like, it was a 1 kilo PR. You probably could have done this last week. Honestly, if we would have pushed it last week, you could have done even more. You didn't get better. And I think that can almost be a band aid sometimes, where it's like, you push, you push, you push. Oh, we're doing 1 kilo PRs. And like, while they're relevant, the question always is, could you have done that before? If you could have done it before, you actually didn't get better. So
Right.
what is this like performance relevant increase that actually signifies like an improvement or uh, a change in their profile that's like relevant enough to say, the next time we compete, we're going to put kilos on our total, instead of, you just happen to have a better day. Your readiness
Yeah.
was just in a spot
Yeah.
where it allowed you to express that more efficiently. That's
Here's
actually a
a
really tricky question.
here's a question for you, because we've talked about this and we're kind of dancing around something that we both are aware of exists, but I don't know many people that have used this data, this formula. But we talk about like the K value, right? The coefficient of intensity that Medvedev spoke of he wrote about in his books. And this is like essentially a metric by which you would calculate, based on statistical data, you'd calculate about how much progress can be made based on a change in the loading of the training. And he had a lot of statistical data to back up this formula. In so much as he could say, if your K value was 38% of your total, and you increased the weight of the barbell, the average weight of the barbell, by 4 kilograms in the pre-competition phase, you should see a 10 kilo increase in your total, regardless of weight class. To me, that you'd even write something like that without having statistical data to back it up is interesting. Like, so I mean, he obviously he had statistics to back it up. This is all based off of the research he had done. It's interesting, right? Because to me, it's like, well, that's remarkable information if it's accurate, if it's reliable. Because theoretically, you could track training and say, yeah, like, we're gonna escalate the training by this much and have a predictable outcome, which just seems bizarre to me as anyone, a coach, right? But maybe this is actually a good starting point for implementing the ability to track progress, to track someone's fitness level, their ability to lift maximum weights. Like, what is the training doing? Is it moving closer to that? What are your thoughts on K value?
And well, we had an extensive conversation. It was a meeting we were having. It's like a business meeting, and then we ended up talking about programming for like 40 minutes.
Yes, yeah,
as
they
one
always
does.
do.
Yeah, and we started talking about workout structures, and we've actually made a lot of content in the past. We've done a lot of podcasts, and we've talked about different structures for workouts and when they're relevant and how they're relevant. And a lot of this, I think, generally the conversations come down to peak intensity and quality of training. And then I think a broader question, and we kind of zoom back out. So we zoom back out to the original question for this podcast, which is, if all information is knowable or known, does coaching or programming become one thing for each person,
Right.
where there's like an optimal? And I would say this is support for that, which is when you zoom out and you say that when the average weight on the bar increases by X amount, you get a resultant increase in performance. So then you zoom back out a little bit more and you say, how do we get the average weight on the bar to increase?
Right.
You can do that a ton of different ways, but you need to do it in ways that increases the weight on the barbell. And if that looks like pyramid sets, if that looks like straight sets, if that looks like top sets and down sets, if it looks like waves, they all have different effects, and they all have like noticeably different effects. And there's utility to all of them, but you can't mistake the set structure for the actual most important thing, which is just making sure over time average intensity increases.
Right.
So it's easy to get caught up in like, well, I'm a top set guy and that works for
Yeah.
me, or like, we use flat sets, or hey, I really like waves. And while there's like an immediate effect, and there's probably like a 0.5 to like 5% difference, you would say like a lot of the difference, or a lot of the improvement or change comes from just over time. How does that change that value, and how does it move the weight on the bar up? And I think that's what our conversation originally was like. Does it matter? Yeah, it does. Maybe in intro weeks or work capacity blocks, you're doing more flat sets because you just need to get in work. And you don't have to get fancy with it. But when you're more in like intensified training, maybe you do some sort of pyramid or top set and down set. And then maybe in a competition block, you're doing more waves because you're looking for like a more, what I would call like a more local effect, like more immediate effect. You're not looking for like the effect across time. Because if you're doing waves, like, I don't know how much one block of waves is going to impact a training block, 12 weeks from then. But if you're doing, 10 kilos on average more weight than you've ever done at the same quality, with the same speed characteristics, like I think in 12 weeks you're going to have a pretty noticeable difference in performance, especially if you keep that trend up. So a lot of this distills down to again a removal of the methods um, of training, and more so just looking at those like broader, most important aspects of training, which is like, how do we get the weight on the bar to move up? How do we do more volume of training? How do we do a higher quality of training with the same volumes? How do we increase technical efficiency? So you're looking again at these like foundational pieces, and everything kind of washes out. So these questions of, well, if I did this, this method versus that method, there's going to be a difference. It's like, yeah, there's going to be a difference within a training block, but beyond that, it's more so just like, I think just keeping yourself occupied with like, well, we're going to do on the minute work this block instead of normal rest periods, or we're going to do waves instead of flat sets. And it's like, that's more so an aesthetic difference. That's not like a tangible difference.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's like, it is funny, right? We oftentimes talk about training from both the bottom up or top down perspectives, and it does kind of lend itself this question, like with the idea of like the structure of the session, like top sets or down sets, or your power top or a power bottom or whatever it is. Are you actually, like, is that more than anything just a symptom of trying to execute a certain amount of training load, and the implementation of different structures of training facilitate that in different ways, right? Like waves and top sets and 20 snatches on the minute kind of thing. Like, these are simply just ways to allow an athlete to execute an enormous volume of training without becoming stagnant, and while facilitating a shift in the average weight of the bar, giving you more opportunities to touch 90% without losing the main driver of adaptations, which is this massive work, right? It's like, I mean, like, ultimately it's like, you don't want to necessarily you want to be able to apply a consistent stimulus to somebody, and that stimulus has to be massive, right? There's a huge amount of training that has to be done to drive results. But at the same time, you need to shift that training to be more intense at certain times or more voluminous at certain times. So instead of just handing somebody X amount of reps and sets, you give them a variety of ways to execute this. Does that just allow them to execute that to a better degree, and at the same time allow you to shift training volume towards these higher intensities, which we know is the thing that drives results the most?
Well, and I think you're right. I think that's a great point. And I think it boils down for me to this idea of, so there are two ideas I have. The one is like consolidation of stressors, and I use
Right.
that concept broadly, but it's like just making sure all of your training is similar. So the idea of like cluster sets, if you did cluster sets on one day and you did that for one training block, so you did on Monday we do cluster sets, we do it for 4 weeks, it's like, what effect is that really having, right? Because it's such an underwhelming aspect of the training program that it's just it's an aesthetic. It's like I'm gonna wear my it's novel. It's like I'm gonna wear my Garmin instead of my G-Shock, or I'm gonna wear my my Nikes instead of my Adidas. It's like, yeah, but they're not. There's no difference in the shoe itself. You just have stripes one way, a swoosh on the other. And I think that's kind of what those like small changes actually are, is they're these aesthetic differences that make a program sell, and it sounds sexy. It's this 12-week cluster bump from heaven, and
that's a great name for a program. 12-week cluster bump. That sounds like a really weird like sex thing. Like, yeah, we bumped clusters last night. The old cluster bump. Gonna get a safe sport violation from USAW because I've been bumping clusters with my athletes.
No comment. I think that rivals the whole like sex bot email thing we talked about in the last episode of the podcast, which again, I'm just bombarded with those emails. No idea where they're coming from.
Yeah,
never signed up
I don't
for
know
them.
what. Wow, a lot of pop-ups I'm getting. I don't even know how these got here.
I might as well click on one of them.
These offers look good though. If it's a sale, I mean, it's a sale, right?
Yeah, but I think with the training process, it's like these are just aesthetic differences. So if you say I'm really bought into cluster training, I think you should overwhelmingly use clusters because you're trying to
Right.
stack up changes, and those changes are so small they have to be overwhelming. So if you look at a program I write, and I write programs like this because we're trying to drive certain effects, and I think this has been influenced also by like my conversations with you. But we'll do, you know, say we're working on the position at the knee and the hip, and we're doing a lot of like block work. We'll also do work from the hang at the same position, maybe with another constraint. So it's like no feet hang snatch or no feet hang power snatch, and then we'll have, you know, no feet block work, and then we'll have maybe like a pull to the knee. And then so you can see throughout this program we're really having to thread together a lot of the same stimuli to create as potent an effect as possible, so that it's not
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like, oh, one day we do pull to the knee, day we do deadlift over the bar, and then another day we do a high pull, and it's like those are all kind of different and you're not really stacking together training effects. And I think that's what this needs to become, is like, how much do you have to concentrate a cluster, and how much does it have to reappear throughout a program to have a meaningful effect? And I think it's a lot more frequently than people would probably assume, to where you're
Sure.
doing
Yep.
Monday and Friday, you're doing clusters, and those clusters are going to exist block 1, block 2, block 3. And then it's like, okay, what's the duration between reps? What's the duration, if relevant, between sets? And like, is that held constant? So it might not be the most fun model. It's not the most interesting model, but when you're trying to create an argument for higher rest periods between reps, you
Mm-hmm.
actually have to like double down on that and triple down on it. You can't just say, well, one day we do clusters, one day we do, you know, triples, and then another day we do heavy singles. It's like, I don't know what that's doing really.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, it's like, and then the big question becomes like, ultimately, I always find it interesting that the actual like structure of the individual training days seems to be the least studied thing, right? We do so much research is done on like comparing, equating volume in programs, and there's been some study on like DUP programs, which I would say is probably a bit more in this vein. But it's essentially like, what is the way in which we execute training load, and how does that impact the results? And it's probably just too broad. There's so many possibilities. It's like really difficult to actually like ascertain what the results with that would be. You could do it with like top sets and straight sets probably, if you equated the volume and the average intensity and things. Like, but again, it's like the structure would change things so much, right? Doing a top set and down sets versus doing, you know, progressively heavier sets in a workout might have differences that are so subtle that you wouldn't necessarily be teased out in one, be teased out in one study,
Well, and the hard part
Um,
is that weightlifting is a skill sport, and I think
right.
we have to give credence to the skill aspect, because if you were to study this and you were to study it with more strength or force focused movements, it's a little easier because you can
Yeah.
standardize technique. You can't really standardize technique with a weightlifting movement. So if you say, what's a better protocol in the snatch, a top triple and down triples or straight triples? It's like, I don't know how you would
Right.
answer that.
Right.
The question always, I think, circles back to quality and then
Yeah.
average load. Um,
Yeah.
and then you could say like peak load as well is relevant. But because when you're averaging intensities across the week, it might skew things. You kind of talk about like, if you have a big day in terms of intensity and then a little day in terms of intensity, that's going to average out in a weird way. So you have to look at peak to say, okay, where's the program biased, at least to some extent? So maybe top sets like show you a bias, and then also can help maintain some of the quality of the workout, whereas flat sets, the quality might diminish. But
Right.
I think it'd be really hard to say that matter of factly, given that technical variance exists so strongly in weightlifting. If you did it on like a hack squat, you might get a very obvious answer of like a 5% difference in top set and
Yeah.
down set versus flat set. But I don't know how irrelevant that is when we just can't standardize quality of movement.
I think you need two things to really build, to really gain the knowledge necessary to make any of this stuff super valuable. And those pieces of information are, you have to be able to measure the the, like, you have to grade the technical execution of an exercise, right? And be able to have a constant grade of that. So if you were to look at a squat and you were to break a squat into like 100 possible points and say, okay, hitting depth or not hitting depth, that's minus 30 points. Tipping forward more than 1 degree is minus 5 points, right? All these things that you could essentially equate and get like, okay, your score, you did 5 sets of 3 in the squat and your average score for all of these sets was, 87 points out of 100. You could basically say, like, what is the technical execution, the technical consistency, and grade this. You could look at different structures of workouts and say, do any of these different types of structures, allow for the biggest increase in intensity throughout the workout with the least deviation from the average execution of the technique, right? And then you'd look at, like, well, are there different structures that benefit that more? So 5x3 at 80% might be less good because by set 3, your technical skill qualities have degraded and the sets are worse than if you did, 7 doubles, right? Or clusters, you know what I mean? So it's like you're looking at this thing of like, okay, one, can we quantify the execution of an exercise? And the second would be quantifying actual metrics like fatigue via, bar velocity or something. And so you really need to look at like this analysis that just requires an enormous amount of data, right? And a lot of time to process the data and do something to get the result. But like, you'd ultimately want to be able to say like, hey, is doing this kind of like wave structure, what is the output of that from the standpoint of how it manages fatigue intra-set and intra-workout, and how it allows me to execute with a high precision and high consistency of technical execution. And if you could measure those things, you could then have a situation where you could look at different structures and actually grade them against those metrics.
Well, and a lot of this conversation has been relatively high level in that we start with this question of like, knowing all this information, what do programs look like? And then we broke the information down that would generate a program to have something a little more actionable. When we're talking about quality of workouts, what sort of bandwidth are we looking at? What should the deviation be between perfect and
Right.
minimal viable kind of like technique within a workout, so that people understand like, hey, when I go to execute training, it doesn't matter what workout structure I have, but the quality can only vary, X amount.
I would say you probably are looking at something like, I mean, obviously the lower that is, the better, right? The lower the variation and the lower the deviation, the better, right? It's kind of always our goal to reduce the deviation of technical execution while maintaining the highest level of exertion we can, right? So like a good example of that would be like, let's say you're training, you have a certain number of lifts at 90% planned, right, for each week. The first week you might execute these at, as singles with, whatever rest time you want. So you do 5 singles or something at 90%, and the athlete takes 3 or 4 minutes between each set. And the deviation between reps is, let's say the, 10% deviation, right? Some sets are good, some sets are moderate, but they're all within 10 points of each other. As the program progresses and as the athlete's strength and fitness level increases, you potentially could increase the exertion level of those workouts by making them doubles at 90%, or maybe even a triple, right? And try to preserve that same thing. If you're able to preserve that same 10-point deviation between 2 reps, but with less time between them, then, obviously your technical stability is increasing. Your ability, your resistance to fatigue is improving. Then you could look at like, okay, can we keep that same deviation across 5 sets, each set increasing in intensity? So your first singles at 90, then 92, 93, 95, whatever. Does your 10%, deviation hold consistent across those? then, you know, I mean, like, so you could, that's how I would look at it. Like, how do you apply it in a way that you've got 10% or whatever deviation you say is appropriate, and then you adjust the training to basically reflect the adaptations you're looking for, and can we maintain that, or does that fall off at some point?
Well, I guess that is a personal preference for coaches, how much technical variance they're looking for. And I know Glenn would talk about having a good amount of variance kind of within a session, especially for the strength movements. And I think it kind of makes sense what you're talking about, though, is like over time that should be either tightening up, as in the margin should be closing, or it should be under different conditions. So if you have, you know, I just did a bunch of 90% clean and jerks. It's like if the first jerk is really bad and the second jerk's like pretty good and the third one's the best, the next time I do 90% clean and jerks, they should either be all better or that same
Right.
variance should exist in a harder workout.
Right.
So I never actually kind of like put words to it like that. So I think that's a helpful heuristic for coaches to hear.
Yeah, I would think so. I think also it's like one of these questions of strategic implementation, because, like, you know, you could lift sloppy and lift bigger weights, right? So it's like this weird thing of like, you know, okay, well, we can throw more loading at somebody and their technique degrades, but yeah, I mean, that's a strategy, right?
Right. Okay. So I think there's a lot in this podcast for people to digest. It might require a second round through. I will say most of the conversations between Max and I exist kind of in this format, where we
Yeah.
start with like an idea or a concept, and they just like evolve into, you know, kind of tightly related ideas, but it just kind of keeps moving a little bit. So again, if you need to go back through, get a listen, or if you have any questions, I've had people reach out for consultations. Max has had people reach out. If you want to chat, you can go to philosophicalweightlifting.com. You can go to teammated.com. You can sign up for a consult. If you want to see it in action, right, you can also sign up for coaching, either one-on-one, or you can sign up for the weightlifting.ai. That's just weightlifting.ai. Code 2-week trial gives you 2 weeks free. You can sign up for my one-on-one powerlifting or weightlifting coaching. You can sign up for Max. He has weightlifting, powerlifting, and super total training. And then, Max, if people want to keep up with your other shenanigans, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Max_Aita, or pretty much there. I mean, obviously the podcasts and some YouTube here and there, but that's the place to look.
Awesome. Yeah, guys, if you like the podcast, please leave a review, send some messages to show your support. All of those really help kind of create a driving force that sustains this. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.